Okay, why does the same song sound completely different depending on who mixes it? And why do some people sometimes hate a mix, even though it's beautifully done on a technical level? So in this week's video, I want to talk about how mixing styles actually work. And I want to talk about how things like region, era, personal taste, how all those things shape the way a mix sounds. And I want to talk about this stuff because I believe that knowing about it can help. I think it can help artists that are choosing an engineer, and I think it can help engineers that are looking to level up their game. So different mixing styles exist, and you can intend to go in one direction and end up going towards a different style entirely. And that's because your taste preference may be pulling you in that direction, whether you like it or not. And different mixing styles exist because mixing isn't just technical, it's also aesthetic, it's also emotional. But I think before we launch more into it, we have to think about what actually defines a mixing style. And I think that oftentimes when we're defining a mixing style, it has to do with how the different elements of the mix are treated. So for example, balance and tone, that's one of them. So for example, I think about for balance and tone, things like the vocals. Different styles of music will have very different treatment of the vocals. They might be, for example, very upfront and present and almost separate from the rest of the music, right? Or you might have a vocal track that is more embedded in the rest of the song. And often this has to do with genre, era, a bunch of different things that we're going to end up talking about here in a moment. But that's one example. Another example is like how the bass is treated. And depending on what angle you're looking at with this one, it can also fall under other categories here besides just balance and tone. But for example, is it, are we making it mono or are we letting it be stereo? Is it a huge part of the mix? Is it one of the biggest part of the mixes? Or is it more of a supporting role? Is it heavily saturated or is it more of a warm tone? Things like that impact the mix. Now, besides balance and tone, when we're talking about defining a mixing style, I also think about space, sense of space. So this often has to do with reverb, right? Is the reverb in the piece more abstract or is it more realistic? Are we going for separate worlds or are we going for one unified world? Are we using it more as an instrument or more as a setting a room, creating a space type of thing? And a lot of how I think about music in general, but also specifically sense of space, has to do with that realism versus abstraction concept. I think it's really cool. It's really interesting. Now, besides balance and tone and space, I also think about dynamics when we're defining a mixing style. So how is compression used, for example? How are limiters used, for example? Different styles are going to have widely different treatments. So, for example, you might have more of like a New York style compression where it's very heavily compressed. It's often then EQ'd as well. Or you might have a more open type of treatment for your compression. Now, another thing that I think about when defining mixing styles is how width and placement are used, right? How wide are we making everything? How are we placing things within the stereo spectrum? We talked about bass earlier, right? Bass is another good example of this. Throughout history, bass has been used differently, and oftentimes it has to do with the technology. We'll get into that a little bit. But, depending on the era of a mix, you may have a bass that's right down the middle, or you might have a little bit of a stereo spread with the bass. Different elements have been treated differently throughout genres, throughout styles. And so the decisions that the mixing engineer makes in terms of width and placement also very much impact the mixing style. And one more thing that I think about when I think about mixing styles, I'm sure we can make this list a lot longer if we wanted to, but one more thing that I want to talk about today is the idea of loudness. And I do think of this as a different thing from dynamics, right? Dynamics are kind of how you're treating things within the mix, and loudness is more of like a mastering thing. So it's what the loudness levels are overall, what the goals are for that. That is part of your mixing style, your mix and master style. Now, obviously, there are a million factors at play here when it comes to mixing styles, but personally, I think about two main factors when it comes to things that impact someone's mixing style the most. So it's decade and location. And to be fair, location is getting a bit more blurred with the internet nowadays. But I think that learning the history about location and learning how it then impacts us today, I think it still has an impact. And I think it has value to learn that history. Okay, so now throughout the relatively short history of recording and then mixing music, we've had different decades that have come with completely different tools, and that comes with different defaults, right, for mixing and for music production. So depending on the era during which someone learned to mix music, or also the era during which they had their nostalgic phase with music, so often like your teenage years, right? That's going to impact what your taste is in terms of mixing. And obviously, mixing engineers, we're not just learning during our decade and then freezing and not changing anything. Oftentimes, we learn and we grow and we adapt and we change our methods throughout time. But the way that you learned is often your default, your like normal, and often it then impacts things as you go forward. So you may have a slightly different combo of mixing style than someone that started a decade after you, for example. And it's really important to understand that when you're picking a mixing engineer. The decade that an engineer learned to mix in is often something that they're kind of carrying with them for the rest of their life. So, for example, when I've noticed this the most is when I'm talking to mixing engineers that are older than me, right? And they're giving me advice or talking about how they do their mixes. And one thing that comes to mind is panning. So, with panning, with early panning, they oftentimes didn't have as many choices in terms of where to place things in the stereo spectrum. So when panning first became a thing, I believe it was just center or you hard panned, right? And then at some point, mixing boards got the halfway mark, right? Like the 45-degree type of thing. And so a lot of mixing engineers that came up or learned from people that had that technological limitation, they often choose to only put things center, 45, or hard panned, or something like that, right? Or they just do center or 45. And that is an example of not only the technology impacting things, but it's also an example of the decade impacting things. So because they had that limited technology for so long, there's this whole group of people that learned how to make a mix work with that limitation. And so they choose to carry that forward, even though now they could set the panning wherever they wanted it to be. It could be like 1 degree to the side, but they choose not to because they learned to make it work with that limitation. And I think that's really, really cool. And you'll notice this if you listen to really old mixes, like mixes from the 50s, a lot of them had really what feels like weird panning decisions to us. And a lot of those mixes, they were coming out when panning was first becoming a thing. So part of it is they were figuring out what the conventions were going to be, what people liked, what worked. But sometimes you'll have with old songs, you might have like all the drums to the left and all the lead vocals to the right, and it's very strange for a modern listener. But that's what they were doing at the time. And as you listen to songs throughout the decades, you can go through and find examples of that where you might, as a modern listener, be like, why did they do this? And part of it has to do with the technology limitation, but part of it just has to do with the conventions that we currently have for panning did not exist yet back then. And so they had different conventions back then. And so things were done differently. It's so cool. And again, returning to bass, how bass is treated is another great example of how what decade you learned how to mix in or what decade the person you learned from learned to mix in, how that can impact your mixing style. So for a long time, when people mixed music, they would limit how much bass they had in the mix compared to modern mixes at least, and they would make sure to have the bass below a certain point be mono. And so a lot of that had to do with vinyl records, right? Because if you had too much stereo in your low end, the needle would be likely to skip. And if you had too low end, if you had too much low end in your track, then the needle would also be likely to skip. So it was a limitation of vinyl that people are often still using today. And people use it to varying degrees depending on their style of music and, where they learned and what decade they learned in. But it's something that's still used today by some mixers, and by some it's completely ignored, right? And another good example is mastering loudness, right? Depending on the decade, you're going to have a very different standard for what the norm is for mastering loudness. And obviously there's variations within each decade depending on style and genre and stuff, but there has been a pattern over the decades for what is considered the standard for mastering loudness. And just like the other ones, that has also been impacted by technology and the limitations of technology in different eras. All right, let's talk about regions, location, right? There are 4 main music hubs. So LA, Nashville, New York, and London. Those are kind of considered the 4 main music hubs. And depending on each location, there is a different mixing style that is associated with each location. And again, because of the internet, this stuff's blurring a little bit more, but it still impacts mixing styles today. So when you think about Nashville, they have a bit more of a songwriter focus. So oftentimes mixing styles in Nashville have the vocals much more upfront than mixing styles from elsewhere. And it's to the point where people from other areas or people that didn't come up with this style often feel like the vocals are so upfront and present that they feel disconnected from the rest of the song, and it might feel wrong to them, right? But it's all just personal preference, and it often has to do with where you come from or where the music that you like came from. And, for the Nashville style, for all these styles, I like thinking about how it's evolved over time and how it's changed over time with, different decades and different technologies and stuff like that. And personally, I feel like the Nashville style is kind of more about augmenting the natural recording. So it's a little bit more about realism and getting it to sound beautiful and full and, just working with that natural, organic recording and making it feel realistic. Whereas oftentimes, like the LA style might have more effects and abstract sounds and concepts in there that are then blown up and made larger than life. And both are fun. Both are really fun. But it's interesting to me because I think what used to be considered the pop sound in terms of mixing style and production style is now what is the Nashville style, right? Because old pop, like I'm thinking like 90s pop, and before that, 80s pop, even 70s and 80s, maybe even more so than 90s. But I think about old pop, that often had to do with a lot of realism concepts because digital audio hadn't taken as much of a hold yet. And so we had more realism concepts, which is like, you hear something and you can picture the person playing the guitar, you can picture the person playing the bass, you can picture what the sound is. It's not an abstract sound. So I think about that a lot. I think about the Nashville style of mixing and how that has a lot more to do with what old pop used to be like in LA. And now its home base is more in Nashville, and LA is doing this abstract, different thing now. So then we have the New York style of mixing, which is much more intense and punchy. It's got a lot more compression to it. You think about New York style compression, that's all about getting a more aggressive and punchy and edgy sound to it. So that's really what I think about when I think about the New York style. And I think I might have done a video on New York style compression and parallel compression. So I'll see if I can find it. And if I can, I'll put it in the comments below and I'll put a card up on the screen for you. So you can check that out if you want more info on that. All right. So we're going to talk about LA style mixing and London style mixing in a second here. But before we do, I just want to say that this video is sponsored by me. So if you don't want to deal with any of this stuff, you just want to focus on being an artist and you want to collaborate with a good engineer producer, please go check out my website. It's catonoise.com. And there's actually a get started button that you can click on there. It's just going to ask you a couple questions about your music. And then it takes you to a calendar page where you can book a free, no obligation call with me. So it can either be in Zoom or a phone call. And we can just chat about your music and see if we're a good fit. And, we're talking about mixing styles, production styles, music styles here. So my style is mostly indie cinematic pop. So when I talk about cinematic pop, I'm not talking about necessarily a bunch of strings. I'm talking more about big reverbs and delays that build up and kind of overwhelm you at points. And I like borrowing a lot from hardcore too, where you might have some saturated stuff that kind of overwhelms you and then cuts down for the downbeat. So it's really like playing with your emotions and making you feel kind of like it's a wash coming over you. I grew up listening to a lot of Pink Floyd, and I feel like that whole like washing over you thing comes from Pink Floyd and then also hardcore, which is weird to say both of those together, but I swear to God, that's how I think about it. So yeah, I do a lot of indie pop and alt rock stuff, and sometimes it also blurs out a little bit. Like the indie pop stuff can kind of, because it has a lot of electronic elements, I like doing electronic elements and working a ton on them to make them feel very organic, a lot of texture work to make them feel very organic. But a lot of times that electronic world kind of leaks into some more electronic, dancey, sometimes a little hip hoppy stuff as well. But you can check out my portfolio. It's on my website. So if you're curious, again, please go check out catonoise.com. Thank you. Okay, back to the video. Okay, Los Angeles. When I think about the LA style of mixing, I think about it as compared to New York, for example. It's going to be a bit more natural sounding. It's going to have a little less compression, but we still have a good amount of compression. It still feels fairly processed, fairly it's what I think of as like the modern pop sound is like the LA sound, or one of the modern pop sounds, right? And it also often has a lot of fun delays and reverbs. You might have like reverb throws and stuff like that, and effects throws that are thrown in like an ear candy type of thing. But it does feel a bit more like you're improving the natural recording by adding some fun kind of like sometimes old school pop effects, But when I think about the LA style as it compares to, for example, London or New York, I do think it's a little more concerned with taking the natural recording and then augmenting that, and then maybe adding fun pop effects, right? So we might add some fun old school pop effects, we might add some more modern pop effects, but it also is still kind of centered around augmenting that natural recording in a way that's kind of similar to the Nashville style, but a little more of that like modern tech edge to it. All right, London's mixing style. This is probably the one that I know the least about. I've never been to London. I have been to the other three, right? So I don't know as much about London's mixing style. I'm just not a part of that culture the way I have been with some of the other ones, especially New York and LA. Those are kind of my big two. But with London, I think it's a bit more compressed, a bit more towards like what the New York style is. But London also has a bit more of that pop thing that LA has, but they might even go harder. You know, they do a ton with a lot of fun and wild effects. I think with the London mixing style, there's a lot less concern into what counts as natural, what feels natural. And oftentimes mixed elements have their own space, right? It's not as much about getting, when we're talking about reverb, it's not as much about getting everything to feel like it's in the same space. It's everything can have its own space and can do a bit of its own thing in a way that's not done as much with LA. So those are the four big regional mixing styles. And what I think is interesting is how it pans out when you look at a specific mixing engineer. So for example, me, I'm a mixing engineer. I grew up in the New York area. So I spent from like age 3 until going through college in the New York area. So I started assisting in studios and started working in studios in that area. Then a few years out of school, I moved to Southern California. And I actually have a weird combo because my parents are from Southern California. I technically was born out here. And so I did grow up listening to oldies and music that Southern Californians listened to, right? So I had that the whole time as like an undercurrent, but I also then moved to Southern California and started working in studios here in Southern California. And it's really interesting to me now after I've been here for like, I don't know, over 15 years at this point, I think. I've been here for a while and I've realized that my mixing style has developed into something that feels like a blend of New York and California in some very specific ways. You know, like I like doing New York style compression and I like doing the thing where I add a ton of saturation, kind of overwhelm. It's like the hardcore stuff, right? It feels very New York to me, but I'm putting that on indie pop stuff. So it's weird that I didn't consciously set out to become a blend of these two styles, but just because I was surrounded, I was in those literal areas, it just happened. It happened to be that I developed a blend of those styles and I had access to the internet and was listening to music from all over, but somehow this is how I ended up. I think that's fascinating. Even though we have the internet nowadays, this is what's happened. And I think the moment when I realized this is when I started to realize that for the Southern California artists that I work with, one of the most common mix notes that I get is that they want the reverb to sound more natural. They want everything to feel like it's more in the same place. And so oftentimes what I'm doing is I get that note and I reduce my other reverbs and delays slightly, and then I raise the send to the room reverb, and that fixes it, right? So I'm getting that kind of note that kind of feeds into that whole concept that LA has a bit more of that natural, augmenting the natural and then adding some fun stuff on top of it. And I think that's fascinating. You know, if you knew that I grew up in the New York area, I started working in the New York area, and then I came here, and you think about that, you could probably predict that that might be one of the mix notes that I commonly get, is that people want their vocals to feel more like they're in the same space as their instrumental, for example. Once you understand these regional styles, that type of mix note can actually make a lot more sense. And understanding these factors can help you adapt to different situations and hopefully get what you want out of your music faster. Now, I know I already mentioned this, but I do want to touch upon it one more time. And it's the idea that regions aren't having as big an impact as they used to, right? The internet blurs all that for very obvious reasons, right? It blurs what keeps people isolated in those individual regions, and it is changing the way people mix, which is actually pretty cool. But I think the important thing to keep in mind and to take away from this is the idea that your taste still matters a lot. And, your musical preference, whether you're the engineer or the artist, it has a huge impact on things. It matters. I think it matters a lot. And I think people often forget about this or they discount the impact that this has, but I don't think we should. I think it has a huge impact on things. It's very important to keep in mind. And I think the beautiful thing that kind of stems from all this is the idea that because there is such a diversity of musical preference and there are so many factors that influence musical preference, and it's different for everybody. Everybody has their own unique musical preference profile. And because of that, there often is no right or wrong. Sometimes people, especially in the technology space, talk about it as if there is a right or wrong, and there's just not. There's usually not. There are things that most people might agree on, and you might want to call that a right versus a wrong. But in essence, there really is no right or wrong. And so if you are following what you like and what your preference dictates, then you're probably doing it right. And you shouldn't stress out about whether your mix sounds like a polished 90s pop mix. That's my own personal thing that I had for years, was I was very concerned that my mixes didn't sound like that. And I learned how to do that, but it just didn't do it for me, and I had a lot of self-conscious thoughts about it. And I've learned to kind of embrace the fact that I have this unique style that I have accepted and learned to love. And if you are also struggling with that, I think maybe learning about this can help you too, because it helped me. So there are different styles of mixing, and that's impacted by a whole range of different things. And some of the bigger things that I think tend to impact that are personal preference, your era, your region, right? So for real, if you're an artist and you're choosing an engineer and you have an expectation mismatch, so what you are hoping for in terms of style and what you're envisioning in terms of style is a mismatch for what your engineer is specialized in, what they like to do, what their style is, then that is more likely to lead to disappointment. And I would just keep that in mind. If you're choosing an engineer, you're choosing who to collaborate with, you're choosing who to work with. This is something that's important to know, because if you don't consider this, you don't factor this into your decision, then you are so much more likely to struggle and be disappointed with the outcome of your music. And I'll be honest, when I see artists that are choosing an engineer that works in a completely different genre or style than what they want, I think about it kind of like someone going into a McDonald's and ordering Chinese food. You might get something that's really, really good, but it's not what you were hoping for. Cool. So the takeaway is to look into your engineer's style before picking a mixing engineer. And if you are a mixing engineer, just keep this history in mind, keep this information in mind, because I do think it's a valuable piece of information, collection of information to have in your toolkit going forward. I honestly think it helps you adapt based on the client. I think the goal, whether you're an artist or you're an engineer, is this. It's to know that there is no one correct mix. There are just different perspectives. And the true goal, if I may give you a goal, is to find someone whose perspectives match yours, or someone whose perspectives work well with yours, someone whose perspectives complement yours well. Okay, so that's it. Those are all my thoughts for today. I hope you like the video. Let me know in the comments below, like, comment, subscribe. That stuff really helps my channel. I am an independent channel, so every little thing helps. Show my channel to a friend who might like it. I would so much appreciate it. And if you want to work together, you don't want to deal with any of the engineering stuff, just want to focus on the artist side of things, please check out my website. It's catonoise.com. You can click the Get Started button on there. It asks you just a few short questions about your music, and then you can book a free, no obligation call with me to talk about your music to see if we might be a good fit. Please go check it out. I would so much appreciate it. And I do have a Patreon, so it's patreon.com/catonoise. And my Patreon patrons get some additional content. We have a Discord server we're hanging out on. We're doing a book club on the Discord server. We meet in the voice channel of the Discord server every Sunday morning, and we have so much fun. It's a really small group of us, but we're very much into it. We read all audio engineering and music production books. And my Patreon patrons also get some other perks here or there. Like if I edit and finish a video, I always post it immediately to the Patreon page. So you get some early release videos, stuff like that. So please feel free to check that out if you feel so inclined. It helps keep this channel independent. So I don't have to be a salesperson to you, and we can just talk about actual nerdy music production stuff. And other than that, I come out with videos on Wednesdays, and thank you so much for hanging out. Okay. Oh my gosh, there's an ant on my table. Little ant, get out. You don't belong here. Get out. Oh, God. Okay.